So welcome everyone to the free will debate of 2022. We have on team free will, we have Raymond Tallis, who is, he's a doctor, he's a scientist, he's an author, he's a poet, he has a new book published as well. So many congratulations for that. We have our own James Tartaglia, who is celebrating his 20th year at Keele University. So well done, James. We also have PhD student Jacob Fox. I'm not sure what are you actually studying, Jacob?
Meaning of life.
Marvelous. Well, it's 42. There you go. Sorted.
Yeah,
that's
it
your
is.
PhD done.
That's exactly what. Yeah.
And third year student Charlotte Ellis and Lewis Buck, if you can make yourselves just known. And then on Team Illusion, Team No Free Will, is Tom Clark, founder and director of naturalism.org, which is a naturalistic philosophy website. It's atheistic in nature, it is fully physical. And Tom also specialises in addiction at Brandeis University. So welcome to both our speakers. We also have Dr. Jonathan Head from Keele University, and master's student Ethan Arnold. What's your specialisation, Ethan?
Essentialism and possible worlds.
Marvellous. Okay, I'll pretend I know what you're talking about. And we have first year students Martha Heap and David Finney. If you would like to just make yourselves known briefly. And yes, I am third year student Flick Grant, struggling with my dissertation right now, so hoping to have a little break from this. Speaking first will be Team Free Will, and kicking off will be Professor Raymond Tallis.
Oh, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much indeed for having me. I've got just 5 minutes or so to defend free will. Not easy. So I think it's first of all important to determine what I'm defending it against. Actions, we are told, are physical events, and all such events are stitched into the universal flow of happenings by law-governed causation. What's more, agents rely on causal connectedness and the rule of natural law, unstoppable material necessity, to ensure that what they do has the desired consequences. From this, so the argument goes, we must conclude that far from being the origin of our actions, we are merely conduits through which events pass. We have no free will. The case against free will has, some argue, recently been strengthened by neuroscience. As a neuroscientist, I would tell you it doesn't, and I hope we shall deal with that one in discussion. As for causation as an expression of material necessity, that was put to bed by Hume nearly 300 years ago. So I want to devote my short opening comments to looking in a preliminary way at two things. Firstly, the so-called laws of nature, to which we are supposedly in helpless obeisance. And secondly, the claim that actions, which of course are physical events, the claim that they're just physical events. First of all, the laws of nature. The idea that they have regulative or coercive powers is a hangover from religion, and most philosophers of science have set that aside. I want to argue that what we call the laws of nature are the habits of nature teased out in the laws of science. And it's through the exploitation of the laws of science that we actively utilize the habits of nature to serve our ends. This is a highly unnatural activity. Indeed, science is a spectacular expression of something that lies at the heart of our humanity, our capacity to adopt a position outside of the natural world and to manipulate it more effectively. I want to illustrate the unnatural nature of science with a simple example, the discovery and subsequent utilization of Boyle's law. To discover the law, Boyle reduced the world inside his laboratory to two variables, an independent variable pressure and a dependent variable volume, and to establish their relation to each other. P over V equals K, as everybody remember. It's what we learn and what we use in a vast number of technologies. I say we stand outside of nature in this simple example, and even more so when we travel to CERN to chase after the Higgs boson, because we manipulate what is before us to tease out elements that are not separated in nature. In Boyle's case, pressure and volume. We regulate other elements, such as temperature, that are not otherwise controlled, and separate signals from noise when nature is not a snob and doesn't distinguish signals from noise. Our transformation of the habits of nature into the usable laws of science is not itself dictated by those habits of nature. Physics is possible only because we can adopt a position outside of the physical world. The fact that there is science is the most powerful evidence that science-based determinism does not hold up. So much for the lab, but what about life? The lab is a special place, but it's not metaphysically privileged. It is an extension of what we're up to elsewhere in the world, poking and prodding things to see how they work and how consequently we can manipulate them to serve our ends, to create the tools that are the standing possibility of the amplification of agency. Science just takes this a bit further. The fact that I can, for example, talk to a friend in Australia without raising my voice is simply a spectacular example of what we're doing all the time, acting upon the material world from a virtual outside. And this virtual outside, rooted in intentionality, is vastly expanded into the human world by joining together for collectivization of intentionality. And this is connected with my second topic, the nature of actions. Yes, actions are physical events, just as, but only so far as, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is sound waves. But actions are unlike other events in many respects, and here are a few. First, they're brought into being as realization of general possibilities. They're pulled into existence by a non-existent future rather than being pushed into being by currently active forces or as an effect of the past. And here are a couple of distinctive features of genuine actions in addition to their location in tensed time. Tensed time, by the way, it doesn't exist in the physical world. First, their elements are connected up in a way that's entirely different from the way events are sewn together in the physical world. And secondly, they're accounted for by propositional attitudes, such as intentions and goals that are holistically structured in a way that's fundamentally different from the connectedness of the material world. So I've highlighted the virtual outside from which agents act upon the world, discovering and harnessing the laws of science, which are not to be understood in terms of those laws, the unique structure of and reasons for actions, the entertaining of general possibilities, their location in tense time, and the holism of propositional attitudes. And each of these themes or topics would be worthy of an entire discussion. And then if we had time, we could exhume the discredited idea of causation as material necessity, and also look critically at the idea that neuroscience has proved that we're imprisoned by our brains. But my 5 minutes or more is up. I hope I've successfully started to dismantle some of the framework within which determinists make their case against free will. Without that framework, the case collapses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Now, I'd like to add to that by mentioning what I think is a false dichotomy that makes people think there's something problematic about free will. It seems to me free will is about as unproblematic as anything possibly could be. It's a presupposition of virtually everything we do, and it's also something which we need to presuppose in order to consider ourselves as actually existing, as having a self. So let me tell you about this false dichotomy. The dichotomy is between something being caused or it being random. So supposing there's a big explosion, boom, okay? You might say, well, somebody set the bomb off, or it just happened randomly, and it has to be one or the other. If you start thinking of your own actions in this way, then it can suddenly start seeming confusing. You start to think, well, you know, so I chose tea rather than coffee. Is that something caused by my previous history, or is that just something that randomly happened? You see, but a free action isn't something like an explosion going off, because we have a third kind of way of explaining these things, a way which we use all of the time, and which, as I say, is tied up with our sense of self. And that's in terms of reasons, in terms of what we're aiming to do, in terms of our projects. you mustn't think of an inner event of your experience as a kind of like little inner cause, like this sort of invisible experiential cause that makes you do things, because then it's going to start to look like, you know, was it caused? Okay, so, you know, I choose a tea or coffee during that period of time. Okay, there is a phenomenology. There's what it feels like to me, to be me during that time. Okay. To apply our sort of social framework reasons and reasons and self explanation to that is just think of that period of time as one in which I chose to have tea rather than coffee, one in which I don't particularly care which one I choose, and it doesn't really matter either way. That it, you know, it's not an inexplicable event. It would be an inexplicable event if I chose to, I don't know, drink something that I've never drunk before, which I actually hate. It's just a normal way of explaining things in terms of what's happened to somebody before and what their reasons are. And if you don't think of it in that sense, okay, if you think of somehow an inner event as being either the cause or a random happening, then there's no you. Right? There's no you, because that inner event isn't you. Maybe it's a feeling, or maybe, you know, something else, but it won't be you. You have to think of yourself as doing that, as what was going on during that period. And if you don't think that way, then lots of things just don't make sense, right? So supposing determinism were true and we could, you know, I'm a physical system operating in a deterministic way. I suppose we could have a powerful predicting machine that can tell exactly whether I'm going to move left or right. And supposing that if I choose to go right, then I'll be given £1 million. But the predictor tells me that I will go left. Well, we all know perfectly well that I can just ignore the predictor and turn right and take the £1 million. So just from personal reflective experience on what living is like, you know that this deterministic thesis is true, is false. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, James. Jacob, would you like to start off?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'd like to start by asking you all to think of something. I want you to think of your own mind. Try not to think about what you're looking at or what you're hearing or even what you're thinking about. Think instead about that which is doing the hearing and seeing and thinking. And now think about what might explain this mind that you've just imagined. Let's say you thought of the brain, about its neurotransmitters firing and its fleshy exterior. But notice that this picture of the brain that we just imagined together has a size, a shape, a color, and so on. And notice, in fact, that when you thought of it, you thought about how it looks to you. And now try and imagine what your brain is when it's not being imagined by you. How would you describe it? Maybe describe it as being a certain size or mass or shape. But what does size and mass and shape mean when removed from this context of being experienced? Can we really imagine a brain or a neurotransmitter or a frontal cortex without this being how it appears to you? And what I'm trying to get across is just how central our experience is to everything that we describe or use to explain things. And this isn't to say that there's no way that the world is when not experienced by us. Rather, it's just to say that for us, our mind and experience always seem to be presupposed whenever we speak about anything. So what is this mind that's always presupposed? Well, to put it simply, it's this world that we experience right here, which we interpret in different ways. One way of interpreting our world is as a practical world of doing. And this, in many ways, is more primordial than a scientific, theoretical way of looking at the world. When we look at a hammer, we don't see a collection of atoms or a subatomic field of quarks popping in and out of existence. We see a tool that's used to hammer. A hammer is something that we can do something with. And the same goes for pretty much everything in life. The biologist, when he looks at his microscope, sees something that he can use to discover something. The physicist, when she looks at her equations, sees something abstract that she can manipulate and transform analytically into something else. We're all creatures of doing. But this practical world isn't just one of doing, it's also one of willing. We don't look at the hammer and think somebody somewhere could do something with this, we look at it and we feel the will to use it. And to say that this is an illusion would be the same as saying that our experience of pain is an illusion just because it can be explained by cell activity in the brain. But when we feel pain, we don't think about our cell activity. We think about the subjective experience of pain that we're feeling. In the same way, we don't think about our brain when we will to do something. We think about our experience of willing. Now, part of this practical picture that I've painted is freedom. When we see the half-hammered nail and the hammer sitting beside it, we don't think about our brain deciding to use it. Instead, we think about the hammer and what we want to do with it. And this desire presupposes our freedom to do so. When we experience the world as practical, we experience it as one in which our world is freely directed upon things. Crucially, this default practical way of looking at the world is distinct from the theoretical scientific way of looking at it. As soon as we start to think of the world as a collection of external material to be explained in scientific terms, we're no longer thinking practically. And on the flip side, when we're thinking practically, we're not thinking theoretically. And so there's no need at all for us to use a theoretical understanding of the world and the things within it, like our brains, to explain our practical choices. To do this would be to imply that these two ways of looking at reality are really the same perspective on the world. But in fact, experience shows us that they're two different, mutually distinct perspectives on the same reality. And if we say the practical perspective is illusory, then we have to seriously contend with what we discovered a few minutes ago with our thought experiment. Namely, that the theoretical perspective is, in fact, only a way of thinking about things to the practical experience that it's meant to be explaining in the first place. It would pull the rug out from underneath itself and become meaningless. So the world as we experience it is practical and only makes sense if we presuppose free will. And Lewis?
Thank you very much. So what stands in the way of our understanding of our raw feeling of freedom as truth? The common answer being that our present is determined by past states and laws of the universe. Most determinism requires a hard belief in the predictability of our universe. Random events would seem to be antithetical to past states dictating the present universe. Yet, there are many facets of our reality that we have current understanding of indeterministic phenomena. Radioactive decay, for example, whilst there are overall laws governing the phenomenon, laws which determine the rate at which overall processes must happen for any given radioactive substance, and hence what is the half-life of any given radioactive element, it appears that the emission of individual particles is a random event, there being no known way to predict or control when such an individual emission event will occur. And this is not a standalone case. From quantum mechanics to evolutionary drift, there are positions that support indeterministic outcomes as a part of our reality. Complex biological systems, like ourselves, should be considered within a similar group of indeterministic phenomena. The complexity of the brain may not be reducible to the base understanding of our universe. Considering this, along with our intuition, and that we premise free will throughout our social and political landscape, should give reason to consider trusting ourselves. I'm sure some have heard that skeptics will fall back onto the position that indeterminism gives rise to the same negation of free will as determinism. Random choices or determined neither give rise to our notion of free will. But I'm not asserting that our decisions are random. Instead, I am hoping to highlight that contrary to some opinions, there are many examples of indeterministic and downward causation that we should relate to our own nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Charlotte?
So my argument for free will is moral responsibility. In order to have moral responsibility, you must have free will. The basic definition of moral responsibility is a person or group of people who act voluntarily in accordance with their desires and are aware of the consequences of these actions, but continue to perform them regardless. Now, moral responsibility does not always mean doing something, but it can also be the lack of action, such as a nurse not giving a patient the medication they need, so the patient ends up getting worse. Now, for a person to be morally responsible, they must not have been coerced, forced, or manipulated in any way. It must have been of their own accord. So for a person to be responsible, they must not only have done the action voluntarily, but must also have the intention to do the act and to know and understand the consequences of their actions or lack of action. Now, if determinism is true and we don't have free will, then there cannot be any moral responsibility, as their actions are not their own, but someone else's. And if our actions are forced upon us, then there is no moral responsibility. Then what is the point of laws, judgment, and punishment? Why should we punish those who break the laws, even though, according to determinism, they could not have done otherwise? Without free will and moral responsibility, laws become redundant. Ethics, right and wrong, praise and blame all become redundant. Rationality and reason must also be called into question when discussing free will and responsibility. We have the ability to rationalize things and to see the reason behind our actions. It is this characteristics of rationality that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. But if there is no free will, then we are just like the rest of the animal kingdom without reason, as our acts are not our own, and so we are mere puppets as to whatever controls us. Also, it would be hypocritical to act as if there's no free will, but then carry on acting as if we had free will. The other team are going to argue and try and persuade you that there is no free will so that they can win this debate. And because they're going to try and persuade you to think that they are right, they must admit that you do have free will because you have a choice to make. They might say that the outcome of this debate was already determined and that we only act like we have free will. So if we act like we have it, then surely the simplest explanation is that we do have it. Also, some questions need to be asked. Can we truly see ourselves as good or bad people if our actions are not our own? Should we be made accountable for these actions? Or better yet, can they be correctly attributed to us? And what about consent? Free will is imperative for consent to be given, whether it be sexual consent or patient-doctor consent. If you deny free will, then you forfeit your ability to give consent. And to look at it from this point of view, things become tricky. Thank you, Flick.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody on Team Reality. Now, one thing just before I introduce Team Illusion, if you do have any questions, can we please put them in the chat? If you have a question for Team Reality, please preface your question with QR. If you have a question for Team Illusion, please preface it with QI, and I will go through them on the chat. If you want me to read out the question for you, just put a note in saying please read. Otherwise, obviously, you can just unmute to ask your question when I call on you. Thank you. Jonathan, Dr. Jonathan Head, Keele University, I believe you are up for Team Illusion.
Thanks very much, Flick. And thanks to James for spearheading organising this event. Professor Tallis has recently published a book called Freedom, an Impossible Reality. Well, he was half right. It is impossible, but it's not a reality. So to start off with, we need to establish what we're arguing about. Well, in order really, I think, for this question to really be of philosophical interest, I think we need to decide whether there is the existence of free will as traditionally understood. So clearly there's going to be some different views about that. But certainly we can call it something like a genuine ability to be a cause of our actions apart from outside influences, or an ability to act in such a way that we could have acted otherwise. Now, having learned that this traditional viewpoint of free will is impossible, as our scientific understanding of the world has improved, many philosophers have used what I think of as an avoidance tactic. They've tried to deflate the notion of free will in some sense to make it compatible with our improved scientific image. But that's really just giving up on free will, I think, and I don't think that would really satisfy your random person on the street. So that's I think what I think we should do is I think we need to focus on free will in quite a strong sense. Now, we've had lots of arguments from the other team, but I've yet really to hear anything that goes beyond an unwillingness to give up what is really a pre-scientific, pre-philosophical manifest image of how things seem to be for us. Seems to me that our traditional understanding of agency is something that we've learned is wrong, and we just need to outgrow. It's a myth that we've discovered that just doesn't reflect reality. And no matter how much gloss we put on it, there's no getting around that ultimate fact. Now, that does not necessarily lead to the conclusion that we are unfree. It doesn't mean that we are necessarily confined. It just means that talk of free will is ultimately unhelpful or indeed misleading. We need to distinguish between a manifest image of how things appear to us with regard to our agency and the scientific image of what's really going on. Now, the types of behavior that Raymond Tallis, for example, in his talk referred to, such as scientific experimentation and going around through complex courses of action, any kind of behavior could arguably be manifested by an agent determined by the laws of nature as much as by an incompletely determined agent. A capacity, for example, to reflect upon and manipulate the workings of nature seems at best a neutral point of evidence concerning whether or not we could have acted otherwise and so freely. What needs to be provided is an argument that goes beyond what agency seems to involve. If all the other team can go on is what agency seems to involve, then we can agree with that. We can say, yeah, that is what agency seems to involve, but that is just a mere seeming. And we have very good reasons otherwise to think that that seeming is ultimately just an illusion. So in order to establish free agency, we need to show that freedom is not merely some cherished illusion that we are unwilling to give up. We have to show that it is something that is actually in reality. Yeah, I don't know how much time I've taken there, but that was about what I was saying.
Yeah.
Right, thanks.
Thank you. Tom Clark.
Okay, thanks everyone for getting this debate underway. Ray, James, all good stuff. What I want to say is that libertarian free will is really what's at issue here. So it's the reality of this particular sort of free will that's in question. And I'm going to say it's not real. It's logically and empirically suspect. I don't think there's any reason to be afraid of determinism. And it's very probably the case that universal determinism is not true anyway. But the basic question is, what does indeterminism add or make possible that would contribute to an action being up to me, which I think is the common sense notion of free will. This is not a metaphysically deep notion of free will. It's simply saying that to act freely, what I do, what I think is up to me. And the libertarians want to say, no, we have to go further. We have to say that what's up to me is not just a matter of what I want, what I think, my biological needs, my psychology, or my reasons. There has to be an indeterministic element that somehow adds to what I would call the explanatory determinants of behavior. I want to behave in a way that I can understand that's explanatorily intelligible. And what libertarian free will unfortunately does, it makes agency unintelligible because it adds an indeterministic element that by definition can't be under the control of the agent. So what I would propose, as opposed to libertarian free will, is a kind of based on what I call pragmatic, not universal determinism, a pragmatic determinism, a kind of agency in which I determine outcomes, yes. So determinism is true on the output side, but there's no reason to think it isn't true on the input side, as Jonathan was saying. So consider an actual situation in which you were offered magic mushrooms, say. Now, let's say you turn them down. Now, if you replayed that situation microphysically identical to the way it was, it doesn't seem to me that you would have done anything different. And you don't have the capacity, I claim, to have risen above all the factors in play, whether those are rational factors, the reasons that you had in play, your psychological factors like the fear of a psychedelic experience, or your biological needs that were present at the time. Counterfactually, however, we do have the behavioral flexibility, the freedom, degrees of freedom, as Van Dennett likes to put it, to have acted otherwise had the situation been relevantly different. So what the libertarians have to show is, how does indeterminism make an action more up to me as an agent? I want to say there's no way it can do that. I want to be subject to the explanatory determinants of my behavior. I want to be subject to reason. I want my psychology to be in full gear, and I want my biology to be in full gear too. I want reliable cause and effect relations to exist in the physical world. And Ray has said, and James too, in their different books, that no, the universe is fundamentally, at least has some indeterminism going in it, and it's not causally necessitated. Now, that may be true, but I want causal necessity when it comes to my biology, when it comes to my neural goings on. Intentionality is real, as Ray, I agree with Ray in that respect, but it supervenes on what the physical brain is doing. So there's no reason to want to be free from physical determinism. That's what makes our brains reliable. And there's no reason want to be free of what my reasons dictate my behavior to be. So anywhere you put indeterminism in the equation, it's not going to help free will. It's not going to make actions more up to me. Charlotte said that determinism somehow robs me of my authorship of actions, but that's not true. Agential determinism is what we want and what we actually have. So there's there are, of course, many compatibilists, so-called, out there. I'm not a compatibilist because, getting back to what Charlotte said, I don't think the deterministic sort of freedom that we have justifies moral responsibility in the basic desert sense, which we can get into in the discussion. But we certainly do have freedom and options, if not metaphysically open possibilities, at least it's epistemically open possibilities that, yes, we consider what might happen, but all that consideration, all that deliberation is perfectly consistent with our being deterministic or relatively deterministic systems. And again, indeterminism might be true, it probably is true in the natural world, but it can't add freedom or control or responsibility more than what we already have under determinism. Thanks.
Thank you. David, would you like to?
Sorry, I think it'll be myself speaking next. Sorry, Ethan.
Oh, sorry.
It's
I
okay.
do apologise. I was reading the wrong name.
No, that's okay. So I just wanted to sort of say two things, really. The first is to pick up on some of the defenses that were given by the other team, and the second one is a follow-on from Tom. So the first thing I want to say really is a response to the argument for moral responsibility. And as I think that as an argument goes, I would agree that moral responsibility is something we want to keep. However, as an argument in defense of the existence of free will, it doesn't seem to be a coherent argument. It seems to be, to me, that it's an issue of the pragmatics of having free will, not of the actual metaphysics of the existence of free will. So it's okay to say, hey, if we have free will, we also have moral responsibility. But wanting to have moral responsibility doesn't aid us in showing that there's a metaphysical thing that is free will. My other objection to the arguments given by James and Jacob is that of experience and phenomenology and that which it is like to be X. Now, I totally agree with both of those guys when they say there's something which it is like to be me, there's something which it is like for me to experience things. There's something which it is like to me to feel happiness, to feel sadness, to feel remorse, regret, etc. But we wouldn't say about those feelings, which it is like to be me, that they are not causally linked or supervenient on the physical events. So if I was really, really happy about winning a lot of money on the lottery, you wouldn't say, well, you could have chosen to feel sadness, because you would say that my mental state of happiness is causally connected to the physical event. It doesn't seem to me that there's a difference metaphysically between my phenomenological feeling of happiness and the fact that I couldn't have chosen to have the phenomenological feeling of sadness in that situation, and my phenomenological choice to pick tea over coffee or coffee over tea. Both seem to have the same supervenience over the physical. And it's a common argument from naturalistic dualism that there is a possible world where our phenomenology might not be physical, but in this world it is supervenient on the physical. And so that's what I want to say about those. And then the final thing I wanted to say is about what Tom said about having unconditional free will, the fact that none of the prior conditions to our choice could change, and yet our decision could change. And Tom said that we have the counterfactual capacity to have done otherwise. Had the correct situation changed, we could have done otherwise. But if we allow the free will team to accept that, there still seems to be something unsatisfactory about it. David Lewis particularly has issues with counterpart theories. So what Tom was saying was there is a counterfactual situation in which your counterpart in that situation, so if it was me, it'd be Ethan 1, the situation would be different, and Ethan 1 could have been somewhere else. Ethan 1 could have picked tea over coffee. But Lewis has an issue with saying that the counterpart of me is me. So it doesn't seem satisfactory to say that I could have done different when actually all I'm saying is my counterpart could have done different. That doesn't seem to be me, that seems to be Ethan 1 rather than Ethan. So even if the free will team were to defend Tom's claim that you can have counterfactual conditional free will, there still seems to be some unsatisfactory notion of counterparts of the individual there. And on that, I will pass on to Martha. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it does seem to be true that all actions are in some respects have causes, because in the case where you choose between a sandwich at the shop, you made that choice because you were at that shop looking at the things. So libertarian free will requires the ability to do otherwise. And well, if you believe in that kind of free will, quantum indeterminism, while it might give you ability to do otherwise, wouldn't really be free. Sorry. So where would this other, like this ability that is uncaused come from? So there are some scenarios where this would seem quite absurd, because imagine a scenario if so imagine you have a person and there's something that they really don't want to do. So somebody has to choose between getting £1 million and being tortured. For libertarian free will to be true, there has to be a situation, they have to be able to do otherwise than make the obvious choice, which is choose the £1 million, which seems absurd. While you might be able to say it's more likely that they would make the choice which is in their best interest, they still could choose to be tortured, and the fact that wouldn't seem to match up with their personality because they would have no desire for that doesn't seem to make much sense, and it all seems quite arbitrary. Yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say. Sorry.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you.
All right, we will go straight on to questions. We do have a question from Brandon Robshaw. Brandon, would you like to ask your question?
So I'm picking up on a point that was made by Tom Clark, and I think also picked up by Ethan, but I do want to return to it. I think it's fundamental to the notion of libertarian free will that I could have done otherwise. And to me, that notion does seem incoherent. I think if I'm at a decision point in my life and I make a particular decision, if it were possible to, as it were, rerun the tape, and all the antecedent and attendant circumstances were identical, including the neurological state of play in my brain, I don't see any reason to suppose that I would ever choose anything different, even if you ran the tape an infinite number of times. But if you ran it once and I did something different, I don't think that helps the free will guys either, because then it looks like my actions are random. And I know that Professor Tallis said it's a false dichotomy between determinism and indeterminism, but I must say that I don't think it is.
Okay, does someone from Team Reality want to respond?
Charlotte, you'd like to answer that one?
Yeah, right. That's a very good question, I'd just like to say. So I read it as, is it coherent to say that I could have done otherwise? Well, of course it is coherent, because you have the brain states to think of other options. You rationalize it, you gave the reasons why you would do this and not that. You see the pros and the negatives, you think about it, you don't just do it, which means you've got thought into do something different, you've thought about it. And like, you know, in an instant, you can only think so many things. But as you said, if you rerun the tape and give yourself more time, then yeah, you could choose something different. I've looked back on actions that I've done and thought, if I'd thought about that for a little bit longer, I could have done something different. I would have done it different. So I don't think it's incoherent to say, could I have done otherwise? Of course you can do otherwise. It's more like, would you give yourself the rationality and the reason? Would you think of the reasons why you could do otherwise? Because it's easy to just say, you know, this is my decision and it's always going to be my decision. But if you think things through and you just look at things more logically, you come up with better decisions. And I think that's why it's not coherent. It is coherent to say you could have done otherwise. Of course it is.
Great. And I think Ray would like to add something to that before Brandon comes back. Ray?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I could have done otherwise. Of course, that's impossible if you think the I is the sum total of your life, because already then you've defined the sum total of your life. So the same I could clearly do the same. But when we think about I could have done otherwise, and that's why I think David Lewis's argument, or at least as it's been used, is inappropriate. I am not at any given moment the sum total of my life. It's interesting that determinism, indeterminism has been invoked. It seems to me that if we mean indeterminacy as is seen in quantum mechanics and that sort of level, I mean, that to me is as useless for those of us who embrace freedom as determinism. So we can forget about determinism versus indeterminacy if the indeterminacy lies in the material world. But I wanted to pick up on something I think it was Jonathan said, and I apologize if I've ascribed it to the wrong person, which is somehow we were naive once and we believed in a manifest image of the world that was not informed by science. But now we've grown up and we have a world that's informed by science, and we know all sorts of things that have demonstrated that our free will is an illusion. Well, I'd like to know what those things are, because first of all, as I pointed out, the very fact there is science means that we stand outside the world and see its general patterns and utilize them and so on. But also, if there's a particular reference to neuroscience, all I can say is don't get me started. So perhaps it's probably a good idea if we don't get me started, but if I'm invited to be started, I will be very happy to look at the methodological problems with the neuroscience of free will, and much more important than that, the philosophical problem. But I've already spoken too much.
Brandon, did you want to respond on that, or you're on mute again? I'm sorry.
I don't want to say much, just a brief clarification really in reply to Charlotte. Of course, I don't deny that given a very similar situation in the future, one could do differently because one could reflect, but that's compatibilist free will, that's not libertarian free will. My issue is with having been able to do something that's different to what was already done. I don't think there's any warrant ever for thinking that's possible, that's all.
Can I step in on this one? Well, what I said when I said there was a false dichotomy was that this is what I had in mind, right? Okay, it's not just determined, or this is, I think, the major mistake that people, as I see it, mistake obviously, and that's why I wanted to make a big deal about it, right? Okay, people think it's either determined or random. Now that may be true of events in the physical world, like an explosion, for example, but there is no credible materialist account of consciousness. There isn't. Most of them have gravitated towards eliminativism. The last 10 years have been marked by people exploring anti-materialist theories. That's what all the bestsellers are now, because people didn't want to embrace that, you know, consciousness is an illusion, you don't have a self. You know, it's essentially absurd, as Galen Strawson would say, but lots of other people think. Okay, so in that case, I rule out the possibility that whatever my decisions might be could be reduced to a brain event. Okay, now if you take that as your basis, then you can start to see how it's a false dichotomy, because in order to say that I could have done otherwise, or I freely chose it, or I did it in order to do this, is just to say that this ordinary pattern of explanation, which we use in everyday life, okay, applies to this situation. I mean, once you step outside of this debate, and this is one of the things that worries me about the sort of unreality of philosophy and the way people talk about it these days, right? Once you get out of this debate, of course you'll think to yourself, well, I could do this or I could do that. I mean, it's just a natural way of thinking about it. I mean, at the moment, it's undetermined, as we all think, who's going to be persuaded in this debate. You know, this is a natural way of thinking about life. And it's also the only way of thinking about life which involves, right, which involves a self, of me doing something rather than it just happening to me. Okay, so it's only, it seems to me, going to be a dichotomy between caused or random, between determinism and indeterminism, if you could reduce conscious experience to the physical world. But the only reason to think that is because of an ancient metaphysics, which goes back to Democritus in ancient Greece, and is not been believed by most philosophers throughout history, and over the last few decades has increasingly been shown to be false, which some of the most famous philosophers of like recent times, like Wittgenstein and Russell, thought were completely absurd, but nevertheless took off in American philosophy after World War II.
Okay, I'm gonna, Ethan obviously clearly has something to say. I'll get a brief answer from you, and then we need to move on to another question, please.
No, it's okay, honestly. If we stretch for time, just move on. It's not a problem at all.
No, it's fine. I just want to make sure we give everyone the chance to ask a question, but if you had a response, then
yeah,
make it brief.
Could I just say just a couple of things? My question to James would be, and to Ray, if you could have done otherwise in an actual situation, why didn't you? I think the libertarian idea of agency leaves it a mystery, even to yourself, as to why you acted as you did. So I just don't see how, again, how indeterminism, separating yourself from what your brain does, supposing that experience is somehow separate from the material world, buys you any kind of coherent agency if you can't explain to me why you didn't do otherwise.
Could I answer that? Because
Sure.
you chose. Because you chose.
Right, but that's
I made a decision. So there
Right.
were reasons to do this. There were reasons to this, you know, and I tortured myself with it. Oh, I can't decide which one. And then something happened in the world. I made a decision. That's
right,
how we think about
and
it.
that something happening, you can't explain what it was on your account, because if you could, it would be a mechanistic, algorithmic, deterministic explanation of how your reasons determine your behavior.
To say that I chose is to spread this normal pattern of explanation, which involves wanting to do things and agents over a period of my subjective life. So for a certain period of my life, I felt a certain way, you know, and it's not a direct match. Okay, it's not a direct match. That's not how our understanding of mind works. Our understanding of mind is false and confusing in many, many ways, as I'm sure you know, I think. Okay, but what you do is over that period of your life, you spread, you know, a straightforward, what I call a framework understanding, according to which I did things for reasons. And, you know, that's the way I felt over a certain period of life when I was deliberating. And then at a certain point, something happened, which was my decision. And I don't think there's anything that we know scientifically or philosophically which conflicts with those explanations being true.
Right, but I
would just recognize we transcend our brains. We do transcend our brains. That basically what happens in the brain, and I speak as a brain scientist, essentially is a necessary condition for all sorts of things. Chop my head off, my IQ falls, and so on and so forth. But essentially, the brain is a necessary condition, but actually it doesn't account for the world we're living in. We are a community of minds which has been woven out of the intentional aspects of consciousness. And it's there within the community of minds that we make decisions. Of course, when I've had a bash on the head and I've become unconscious, then it's all brain activity again. But I think the notion that we have to find our choice by choosing within our brains is clearly not the case. You know, we don't, as it were, we're not brains choosing brain activity, which would be impossible. We are persons who transcend our brains through being part of a community of minds. Something that cannot be explained, I have to say, on an entirely physicalist account of the world.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question now. James O'Leary, I believe you have a question for Team Illusion.
Hi there, yes. I would like to know if you can give an account of why there seems to be a clear phenomenological difference between freedom and not being free. So to clarify, it seems very clear that if I choose to do something because I felt like it, that seems very free to me. Whereas if I do something because somebody was forcing me to, that doesn't seem very free at all. Can you give a reason why that feels different if there is no actual difference?
James, do you want to take that since I've spoken?
No, I'm happy to let you jump in, Tom.
Well, the phenomenology of freedom is simply the fact that there is no one holding a gun to my head, and therefore my spontaneous thoughts and deliberations and actions do arise, I would say, from my brain activity uncoerced by anyone. However, if there is someone with a gun to my head forcing me to do something, my brain states, the intentionality arising, my consideration of possibilities is indeed constrained by that person with the gun. And so my phenomenology of being coerced is evident and quite real. So I don't think there's any metaphysically deep problem with the phenomenology of feeling free. I think they're both explicable as being metaphysically consistent with determinism. And as I said before, any indeterminism wouldn't add to the freedom I have to resist the gun to the head or not.
Raymond, I think you had your hand up.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think it's a really, really good question. There is a total difference between me falling down the stairs because I've had a seizure and me walking down the stairs in order to catch a train, in order to go to London, in order to attend a meeting where I will make the case for better stroke patients, for stroke care for patients, which I did endlessly, I have to say, over a period of 10 years. Now, that kind of structure of behavior is totally different from anything that can be explained by, as it were, the operation of gravitational forces on my body and so on and so forth. That is where we operate our freedom, in this very complex world. And all the elements that are put together in walking down the stairs, catching a train, avoiding the dog dirt on the way to the train, getting on the train, having a coffee, reading the papers, to be up to speed for the meeting, checking and this and that. All of that is a totally different kind of organization and structuration of physical events than are seen in the unfolding of physical events in the natural world. And these are the utterly obvious distinguishing features of free actions as opposed to unfree events, which sometimes catch up on us, like when we have a seizure and fall down the stairs.
Thank you. I don't have any more team reality questions, but Gabe is asking, which I'll read out. Jonathan appealed to scientific development as establishing that freedom is illusory. I would like to ask Team Illusion, what would a scientific result which did support the notion of free will look like?
Yeah, I was wondering, sorry, yeah, I just want to say something about the point that Professor Tallis has just raised. Yeah, I read your book with great interest, and I sort of read the bit about how these sort of complex courses of action sort of fit together, but I don't really understand how that's supposed to be an argument for free will. I mean, you just said these events are sort of not part of the everyday workings of the natural world, or, you know, I'm sorry, I can't remember exact phrase used. Well, those very much do look like natural events in the world. To me, this just seems to be how the world is. There are quite complex, dynamic, organic processes that go around and seem to be, you know, doing things. Though I just deny that they have the kind of free will that we mythically thought we had in the past. I don't see how, you know, saying, oh, well, there are these very complex courses of action that we do. I don't see how that adds anything at all to an argument for free will. So yeah, I just wanted to just respond to that last point. Now, just to say something about Gabe's question. I hope I see what he's getting at there. I mean, my response to that would be that you know, where I distinguish between the manifest image and the scientific image, and so there is no, on my view, and I wouldn't necessarily speak for others on my team, but on my view, there wouldn't be a scientific result which supported the notion of a free will, because we're talking about different spheres. You know, we're talking about, on the one hand, science, on the other hand, we're talking about a myth that I believe is incompatible with science. So that would be, you know, my response. It's, you know, I see it as an analogy with science and religion. You know, there wouldn't be, in my view, a scientific result that would, you know, disprove the existence of God. You know, you could always find some sort of religious experience for how a particular scientific result would be compatible with the existence of God. But the reason for that is, you know, they're just two different things. On the one hand, you've got science. On the other hand, you've got what I see as a myth. So that would be my response to Gabe's question there.
Yeah, if I could just add, there's a libertarian, Mark Balaguer, who says that, yeah, there might eventually become scientific evidence for indeterminism, say at the quantum level, and then further up in the chain of influence as we get to human behavior. I'm not sure where that noise is coming from. But so he at least admits that we don't yet have determinate, that is definitive evidence that indeterminism does play a role anywhere along the line. But I also would say that both Ray and James are defending libertarian free will not on the basis, well, they do actually, they both deny physical causation in the physical, or determinism in the physical world. They both say that, but they also are basing their defense of libertarian free will on James's part as a radical disconnection or an idealism that he says is the philosophy of freedom. Okay, so there's that very deep debate on the philosophical grounds. And Ray wants to say that our freedom comes because we have a virtual distance provided by intentionality. Now, okay, virtual for sure, but as physical creatures, as Ray acknowledges, there's no reason to think that the virtual world of simulating possibilities is in any sense disconnected from the brain, that in any sense it rises above the physicality, the materiality, and the cause and effect, I hope, reliable relations that exist in the neurons that are now creating my phenomenal experience. Somehow, I agree, we don't have getting back to James's point, we don't have a subtle explanation of consciousness, but that's an appeal to mystery. And appeals to mystery cannot get you very far when it comes to establishing the libertarian free will.
The appeal to an actual mystery isn't actually dodgy, and there is an actual mystery there. But let's say I'm walking towards a meeting. Of course, the fact I can walk towards a meeting is because action and reaction are equal and opposite. I'm pushing against the pavement's propelling me forward. But actually, if you describe what I was doing in going to this meeting in order to make the case for improved national stroke services for the UK, if you tried to describe that in physical terms, in terms of, you know, either Einsteinian or quantum mechanics, you would actually completely miss the point. You'd miss the point of how things are stitched together in the way that then is quite different from the way they're stitched together in a sequence of physical events in the absence of human agents.
Sure, I agree, they're differently stitched together, but how does unstitching them in any respect, which is what indeterminism does, make you more of an agent with better intentions and better competence?
It's not a question of indeterminism. I find indeterminism as useless as determinism.
Good.
They're absolutely both useless, just like the appeal to quantum mechanics, quantum indeterminacy. Basically, chaos isn't exactly a supporter of freedom. It's about something that's put together in a different sort of way. And if we can't see the complexity of human actions, which doesn't in any way replicate what is seen in the unfolding of avalanche or all the things that we see in the physical world, then I don't know how one can be so blind. And by the way, I'm not a libertarian. I do believe in the determinism of the material world. I'm actually a strong compatibilist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then you'd be able to explain to me then why it would be in an actual situation that you could have done otherwise than what you did.
Sure, I could do otherwise. I could decide not to turn up to the meeting on stroke and decide my values in the end. It's probably better to do a longer ward round than actually to go to the meeting on stroke, because everybody's complained that professors are always at national meetings, etc.
In the actual situation as it took place, you could have done otherwise, microphysically identical situation.
Well, you shouldn't say microphysically. That already implies that the thing is settled at the microphysical level. It isn't settled at that level.
Right. You're saying it's settled at the rational level. If it's settled at the rational level, you could explain to me, there would be no reason to think you would have done otherwise, given your reasons in the actual situation. Is that correct?
Yes, because basically propositional attitudes are not effects or causes.
Well,
including
they explain why you do what you do. So they would have to have been otherwise for you to have done something different, but I'll leave it at that.
Kind of explanation. The explanation that I can move forward on the pavement because of action, reaction, equal opposite are quite different from the sort of explanation we invoke when we say that I've prioritized doing a ward round as opposed to going to a national meeting. That's a different kind of explanation. It's not action, reaction, equal opposite stuff, even less is it quantum mechanics.
I agree it's a different kind of explanation, but I don't see that as a kind of explanation that allows you to have done otherwise in a situation where you were going to your meeting.
Okay, I'm going to ask, Josie has a question for Team Illusion. Nobody has any questions for Team Reality. So yeah, another Team Illusion. Josie, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. So I think a couple of persons in Team Illusions have used the notion of supervenience. I think it may have been Professor Tom Clark and Ethan, but I could be wrong. And I can't remember exactly how you used it, but I assume that you used it to say, well, there are causal networks of events that explain what happens, and then actions somewhat supervene upon these. And it's a way of, I suppose, preserving aspects of the manifest image by saying that you can say that it supervenes upon the scientific image in the way in which one can say, well, look, you can keep colors or you can keep hardness, because you can explain it by reference to the molecular structure or something and so on. But I suppose that this is probably in line with what Professor Tallis is saying, is that actually actions don't supervene. They cannot supervene upon events because the concept of action is a completely different concept. We explain actions by rationalizing them. So we understand why somebody does what they do when we understand the point of what they do. So what I'm saying to you is that I don't think that we can preserve any meaningful notion of acting, of action. You may preserve some notion of it, but not any meaningful one through the relationship supervenience, because I suppose at the basic level of neurophysiology, there are certain causal networks, but reasons are not part of that causal networks, they're normative. So you cannot really have them. So I think you might as well be an eliminativist. That might be a more, perhaps a more consistent position to hold. To which I would say, why should one take the scientific image to be primary? Why should one believe that this form of explanations has to be ontologically basic? Clearly, I mean, I'm not an enemy of science. I think science is really important, but I also think that there is a time and a place for scientific explanations and a time and a place for humanistic explanations. If you're an explanatory pluralist, you can actually say that, sometimes you have to explain things by appealing to reasons. And when you do that, then you are treating, people as making decisions, not necessarily that there was some sort of internal monologue inside their head, but that's how you explain them. And when you are, on the other hand, looking at them from a different point of view, then you're providing your neurophilosophical explanations. There doesn't need to be any deep conflict. You need to switch from one to the other, and that's what we do, in fact, all the time. So the question is, I think that your notion of supervenience is not going to preserve a meaningful notion of action. You might as well be an eliminativist about actually us acting in any meaningful way. Thank you.
Who wants to respond to that?
James, do you want to? Sorry, not James. Jonathan. I've got these J's mixed up. Okay. I don't think, Giuseppina, I don't think there's any conflict between a reasons-based notion or explanation of agency and a view which says that my rational capacities supervene on what my brain is doing. I don't think we need to be eliminativists. Dan Dennett has written a book called The Intentional Stance, in which he makes, I think, a convincing case that our intentionality, our belief desire explanations, which you're appealing to and Ray is appealing to, are perfectly valid. And I think they're valid, but I don't think there's any conflict between explanation at that level and say, a neurological explanation, a causally push-pull type of explanation. Obviously, the latter sort of explanation of a physicalist explanation of intentionality is out of reach and may never be within reach. But certainly, intentional behavior, rationality has to be consistent with whatever laws are governing the microconstituents of my brain. That's what supervenience would say. In order for me to have deliberated differently, the state of my brain would have to have been different. So there has to be consistency at that level. It doesn't mean that you can explain reasons-based rationality or intentionality at the physicalist level. I don't think that's probably in the offing, but I think there's no reason to think that there's any deep inconsistency there. So I don't think we need to go to an eliminativist idea that reasons are not explanatory. That would be, I think, crazy.
Can I quickly respond? I do not think that rationalizing explanations are Humean causes. So I think that when we rationalize what somebody does, we don't invoke a belief and a desire as an antecedent condition of the action. If you do that, you don't explain an action, you explain a piece of behavior. That's a kind of nomological explanations whereby you appeal to some antecedent conditions and the general law, and you sort of say, well, the belief supervenes upon the brain state. But I don't think the rationalizing explanations have that logical structure. I think that what they're showing is the point of the action. And in order to show the point of the action, you have to see how the action is logically entailed by a kind of premise. And the premise is not like a brain state or a psychological state. So I would stick my ground here and say rationalizing explanations are not belief desire explanations. There are different kinds of explanations. So you either eliminate them, and in which case, you have to accept that, perhaps you don't want to eliminate them from language. You allow us to speak in this way, but we are really speaking like the vulgar. Or I think you have to say that there is a deep incompatibility, and if you want to keep them, then you have to have a different story about the relationship between the scientific and the manifest image.
Yeah, well, I agree that reasons-based explanations are not perhaps assimilatable to a causal view of behavior. I mean, there's a lot of debate about that, but again, I think we simply disagree about the possible compatibility of intentionality and the brain. And Ray somehow believes that no, intentionality somehow has to float free or escape physical, mechanistic the reality of who we are. That's why he says we have to stand outside of nature in some respect. I don't think we stand outside of nature at all. I think it would be, and I think that's Jonathan's point as well, that we've gotten the idea that we stand outside, either in our rationality or intentionality, stand outside our physical beings, naturally evolved selves, is a myth, and one that we do well to get rid of.
I'm just going to, can Ethan, sorry, Josie, can Ethan just respond very quickly because he's had his hand up. And then we kind of only have 5 minutes. I know Soren has a question, so I do apologise. Ethan.
Yeah, thank you. So my point on this was my use of supervenience here was more of a direct response to what James and Jacob were proposing, which was that our free will seems to come from our phenomenology, and insofar as there is something different to the physical, which it is like to be us, and our choice, our ability to choose otherwise, our ability to choose what we choose or choose like could have chosen otherwise, comes from that phenomenological distinction between the physical and the mental. But I attempted to draw a similarity within that to our phenomenological approach to emotions as well. There seems to be a non-physical way which it feels like to me to feel happiness, to feel sadness. And so the means by which I use supervenience here is to say, okay, maybe there is this thing which it is like to be me, which appears to be non-physical. But even some dualists, you know, the most famous of those, who the people who know me will chuckle at, is David Chalmers, who says, hey, we've got this naturalistic dualism. We could have had a mind which is non-physical. There is a possible world where it is non-physical. But in this world, in the actual world, it seems to be that our phenomenology, that which it is like to be us, our feeling of happiness, our feeling of sadness, is supervenient on the physical. Once the physical changes, it seems to be that our mental states change. Now, if we can say that about our feelings of happiness and our feelings of sadness, it seems to me that, okay, maybe our ability to choose the reasons, the rational reasons for that is supervenient. Am I over on time?
No, well, you just kind of froze then, but that's fine.
Oh,
Jacob,
sorry.
I'm going to give you 30 seconds and then I'm moving on to Soren's question.
There we are. Yeah, no worries. So I think you're approaching the question the wrong way around. I mean, this has been running throughout the whole discussion. There's in many of Team Illusion's responses, there's the underlying presupposition that we have to interpret the naturalistic world as this like ontological foundation, and we need to therefore interpret freedom as being causal. And that, I think that reflects through in how you talk about supervenience as well, when I think as we can turn the question around and ask what is it about our experience that includes both subject and object that we can take as epistemically basic, and then we can develop from there. And it seems like you place the onus on the naturalistic side of things in that respect, but I think if we go down that route, we can't make sense of the experience that we started with, which we're trying to explain, which is this experience of the entire subjective objective world that we experience. Whereas if we go down the subjective route, we get to maintain a picture of reality in which naturalism has its place in the phenomenal world that we experience. But we also have this place for non-causal freedom that doesn't need to be interpreted in this kind of objective way. And I think that's run through the whole debate, this kind of presupposition that Team Illusion's been, running under.
Right, Soren, if you want to ask your question, we've got I'm going to give it 3 minutes. We're going to go a little bit over, but 3 minutes for question and answers, and then it is vote time. Go ahead, Soren.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for all the discussion so far. So the question, I'm just going to read it. So the question is: say you have action A, which is the result of a combination of a set of physical causes and set of reasons. Is it not possible? Can we not say that? Well, can we say, or can we not say that we could have done otherwise, even if the same sets of causes and reasons always produce A? So assuming it's true that the same sets of causes and reasons always produce A, does it follow then that we have to conclude we couldn't have done otherwise, or is it still possible to say, well, despite the fact that it's always the case that these sets of reasons will lead to A, it's still possible for us to say that we could have done otherwise?
Well, I
like
think
to respond. Sorry, Tom, go on.
Yeah, Soren, I think, first of all, I'm glad you talked about reasons and causes in the same breath. That's great, because it brings up the two levels, at least two levels of explanation, which figure in how we explain ourselves to ourselves. And you asked, well, is there any reason to think that we couldn't have done otherwise? I think, and we've discussed this before, that the way to answer yes to the question is to say in a counterfactual situation, in a future situation, is very likely you would do or could have done, you would do otherwise if something had been relevantly different. But I don't think there's any reason, which is what you were getting at, in an actual situation, to suppose that given your reasons, your psychology, your physical state of affairs, your brain states, that you would have done otherwise. And I think Brandon expressed this very well in his question. So that, yeah, yes, you could have done otherwise had the situation been relevantly different, given your reasons and your causes. But in an actual situation, the one that's unfolding right now, no one has the capacity to have risen above the various explanatory determinants at whatever level, reasons, psychology, or biological, that it can explain their behavior.
Okay, team reality, you've got 1 minute to respond.
May I? I'll go with James. Or may I?
No, you go for it, Ray. You go for it.
I mean, there is this assumption that reasons and causes are, as it were, two inputs of comparable nature, and they're utterly, utterly different. I mean, reasons, we spell it out in Overscroft large print, but I mean, essentially, reasons are totally different things from causes. Basically, causes in the natural world do not weigh up, as it were, the effects they might have. They don't, there's nothing normative or modal in the natural world. There's not even possibility in the natural world. There are only actualities. Of course, actions are driven by envisaged possibilities. So the assumption that somehow reasons and causes, as it were, are two kinds of comparable input, for me, it already, and I think it's been said nicely, much better than I did, which is the assumption that there's a presupposed materialist ontology, which the illusionists embrace. And I have to say that materialist ontology doesn't do justice to the complexity of our lives and the reality of our lives.
Thank you.
I don't think a materialist ontology subtracts at all from complexity. And moreover, I don't think the illusionists have to be materialists. We don't know how experience consciousness arises. And it could be that on a naturalistic, science-based perspective, that consciousness may not be material. But I just don't see how that would add to our freedom in terms of being agents that determine our own behavior.
Thank you very much, everybody. I am going to wrap it up there. Gabe, I am sorry that I didn't get back to your follow-up question. I do apologise. We did run out of time. Right, if everybody, it is vote time. If you could put in the chat for me, Q or I, and then you can talk amongst yourselves whilst I do maths. Are
the speakers allowed to vote, or is that wrong and corrupt?
Oh, Oh, I don't know.
just wondered.
I know nothing about corruption, so
I'm just asking for a friend. I didn't know whether we could actually vote for our positions or
I
not.
would probably say that speakers are not allowed to vote.
Okay, thank you.
That is my decision, and it's final.
Yeah, certainly. That sounds good.
Cliff, what does the Q stand for? Do you mean R and I?
Yes, but I will know if people put Q now what I mean. Letters are hard. Time is up, and I'm delighted to announce, I shouldn't say that because that shows my bias, that the winner is Team Reality. Well done, Team Reality.
Oh, sigh.
Guys.
No, I was going to say there's lots of silent celebration then. Come on, we want some
This is the I just like to make a little speech, you know. I mean, this is a great moment in my life. 20 years at Keele. Now we won.
Yeah, as if the turkeys would vote for Christmas.
Oh, thank God for that.
Well, what was Flick? What was the vote tally?
It was 11-8.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well,
so yeah, not everybody voted because there were more participants. I think some have gone, but yeah, not everybody voted. But to those that did, well done.
Jonathan, we have work to do.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I think that vote was entirely predictable. It was determined all the way, and I knew right from the beginning what would happen.
Well, yes. What was the point in you all turning up?
That's what I said in my argument. That's exactly what I said.
I must say, I've had the time of my life. So you probably think I should get out more, but I've had one of the best evenings I've had. So thank you.
Yeah. Flick, thank you for great moderation. You did a fantastic job.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Flick, you were great. Perfect.
I was trying not to be overly rude and say you're over your time because I don't like to be rude to people. But you know, James did say he completely failed my dissertation if I wasn't. So
I would have, yeah.
And also, I like the power, quite frankly. So.
Yeah, the power suited you, Flick.
Thank you. Oh God, what will this lead to? First the debate, next the world.
Right, everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Thank you all for
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.